I remember seeing a YouTube video, or several YouTube videos made by reactionaries about comic book characters who retroactively had either their race, gender, or sexual orientation changed. And while to some degree I can agree that it's not productive or progressive to simply take a pre-existing character and turn them into something they were not before, there was another part about what they said that kind of stuck with me. They all say something to the effect of, "And this is why manga is outperforming comic books. Because being too woke is what has been killing comic books, apparently." Regardless, even though I do enjoy comic books from time to time, I'm not exactly a comic book fan. I have certainly read my fair share of them, but I'm not waiting for the next issue to come out, nor am I keeping up on the latest news about comic books. Meanwhile, I am a pretty big fan of manga. However, if I had to tell you why I prefer manga over comic books, I'd say it's less about the wokeness of comic books and more about the style of the story or the continuity of the characters themselves that appear in manga. Either fortunately or unfortunately, the same comic book continuities are written by multiple different writers. My issue with comic books is that characters lack consistency. In one Spider-Man issue, Mary Jane can be an extremely well-written and compelling character. In another issue, she can be the most insufferable, disloyal, and petty bitch you've ever had the displeasure of reading about. Something about too many cooks spoiling the broth, I guess. Comic books have suffered from this issue for a while, in my opinion. Continuity is ever-changing, and even though the characters we read about will sometimes be as we remember them, that's not always true. And sometimes it can be to the benefit. New writers can bring new ideas, which in turn can be adopted by the fan base as canon. Comic books, in my opinion, though, just lack a lot of consistency that manga has. It's not just wokeness, which is destroying them. It's writers who misunderstand what the character is all about. It's writers who are simply different people trying to write the same character. And the thing about writers is that their perspectives will always shape what and who they write about. Manga, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have something like that. Or at least most of them don't. A lot of manga starts and ends with the same writer, and a lot of manga also comes with a lot of fresh ideas. But what about the manga that have been going on for decades now? I think the other thing that holds comic books back is simply because they've been around for too long, or at least the same stories have been told, retold, rebooted, reformatted, rewritten over and over and over again for the last few decades. We grew up with them, our parents grew up with them, even our grandparents might have grown up with them. Manga and anime doesn't really have that yet, or at least not the ones that we typically watch and praise as being good. Sure, there are some that are getting close, and there are a few franchises we can point to as the exception of the rule, but they are only exceptions. When was the last time anyone liked Dragon Ball the way they did when it was first airing? Yes, I know there are still fans of the show. I know there is still a community around Dragon Ball, just like there's a community around Batman, Spider-Man, and every other comic book character. However, I'd argue that a great bulk of Dragon Ball fans have a lot of criticisms for the show they love so much, especially for a series like Dragon Ball Super, for example. But does anybody remember how much people disliked Dragon Ball GT? Maybe I'm showing my age, but when Dragon Ball GT first came out, the only discussion I ever found online was how much people hated the show. In fact, there were review channels and video essays constantly decrying how it simply was not like Dragon Ball Z. But when I look back on it, the problem with most fans is that GT was not written by its original author, and therefore held to a higher standard. And when the new author did not meet the arbitrary standards of its fanbase, people got pissed. This happens all the time in media, and the longer a series goes on, the more of a chance it has to happen. Dragon Ball Super had fans excited at first, because it was written by the original creator. But it soon became clear that this was not the Dragon Ball fans loved either. The animation was clunky, the designs were drawn too clean, the story was boring and generally shallow, and on top of that, there was nothing actually new about the series. Super Saiyan God quickly became nothing more than just a stepping stone for Super Saiyan Blue, and Super Saiyan Blue soon became the new Super Saiyan, or Super Saiyan 2 if you want to be technical. But I have to wonder what the online discourse would have been if, for example, Akira Toriyama involved a gay or black character in the story. Now, obviously, someone like Akira Toriyama does not want black or gay people in his story. Akira Toriyama only writes his Japanese story for Japanese people. But what if he hadn't? I personally think that a lot of people would have latched on to that specific character as the root of all the show's problems. I'm not gonna lie to you. I think if the series was poorly written, most people in the online discourse would have claimed that the show had gone woke, and that's why the writing was not good. The truth is, though, that sometimes writers can regress or change with the times. And sometimes a show which resonated with us strongly as kids can stay completely the same, but we as people simply do not feel the same. And therefore we notice flaws which were always there but did not always bother us. Pokemon is another example of a long-running anime, one which has had few interruptions since its release, and I'm specifically speaking on the anime. We can all agree that the games have gone downhill, but what about the anime? Well, for a long time, I think plenty of people agreed with the sentiment that the Pokemon anime was getting worse. It was just not as good as it was in the first and second generations of the anime. But the problem wasn't really that things had changed. The problem was that things hadn't changed. I remember during my years in middle school to high school, I would always watch TV before I had to go to class, and the only thing which was airing at 6 in the morning would be Pokemon. Generations 4 and 5's anime were bad. Not because they were written better or worse than the original, but because I noticed the flaws in the show more. Ash had not changed, and neither had the series as a whole. It became the same repetitious arcs, the same gym leaders, same Ash, different me. The show was bad, not because it was done differently, but because I felt differently about it. And then I would later justify my feelings with logic. After all, there is plenty to criticize about Pokemon as a show. I bring up these examples because I see a lot of channels comparing comic books to anime and manga. However, I don't see a lot of people acknowledging just how long-running comic books are in comparison to manga. I don't think people acknowledge that there are more factors than just diversity hires, which can lead to a poorly written or, in some cases, simply different story. But if you are a writer seeking to make something popular, it can be difficult. We are all reliant on a large company to fill our needs in one way or another. Sure, writers could just make their own comic books, just like you could become an entrepreneur, or you could get promoted to an upper management position at your job. However, for most of us, we are regular people who cannot afford to take risks because the risk of failure could potentially mean starvation and death. I would think of writing like any other job. Sometimes the job you get is not exactly the one you want. Sometimes you check out mentally. Other times it's your dream job and the work you do is fulfilling. When the writer does not like their job, it reflects in their writing. When a writer wants a different job, that also reflects in their writing. Inexperience can also reflect in a person's writing. Perhaps the writer has something profound they wish to say, but simply lack the experience and knowledge of how to say it. That's not to say that there aren't different standards set for different writers by readers themselves, though. In fact, I think any writer with a more left-leaning progressive view is going to be held to a much higher standard of expertise than the right-leaning central or generally non-confrontational belief. How many times have we seen a perfectly fine character put under an extra degree of scrutiny simply because they are black, female, gay, or, God forbid, transsexual? Not to mention, writers, even if they want to make characters like this, are forced to adhere to the rules and guidelines surrounding minority groups in writing. Wouldn't want to feature a gay relationship too prominently, otherwise they can't sell it to China. Just put it in the background so we can erase it later. I don't think most people have a problem with inclusivity in writing. In fact, a lot of the reactionaries claim that they would love to have a character who fits a minority background, but only if it's well written and it's an original character and it doesn't offend their personal sensibilities or religious beliefs. And I think that's where the problem lies. We've got no standards whatsoever with characters who fit our expectations and what's considered normal. Sure, there are plenty of white characters who are poorly written and who are rightfully despised.
Put it in me.
However, I would argue that there are a lot of minority characters who are written decently or even written very well who still get a disproportionate amount of scrutiny. Miles Morales existing as anything other than a perfectly written character like he is in Spider-Verse is a recipe for an online shitstorm debate about who the real Spider-Man is.
Miles, the Black One!
Bill and Frank from The Last of Us TV show was put under scrutiny just for how prominently and boldly the TV show decided to feature their homosexual relationship. And yet, if it had not been as masterfully written as it was, I have no doubt people would be talking about how they ruined the entire show, especially since there are some people who currently hold that belief, despite how good the story was. The problem is, most people will judge whether a character is good based on their emotions, and justify those emotions with some sort of logic after the fact. Most characters who are written just decently or fine will not always get us to start nitpicking that character bit by bit. A lot of times we just ignore those characters instead of finding everything the writer did wrong and could have done better. And yet, when the character's very existence makes us uncomfortable or angry, that's when we really start looking for things we don't like about them. Things which may have started with the race, gender, or sexual orientation of the character, but which are not at all related to the race, gender, or sexual orientation of the character. After all, we must convince ourselves that we dislike the character on objective merits, not anything as bad as being internally racist or homophobic. I think this is something I had to realize a little while ago when I was in high school. I speak as if I know how reactionary audiences think because I used to be a part of that audience. I used to be the dumb high schooler who thought Korra was a bad character simply because she was not as well written as Aang was. That a character could never be good enough. They needed to be better so that real racists had nothing to say about them. A minority character needed to be as compelling as possible. They needed to be extra good. Otherwise, it was just inclusion for inclusion's sake. But why? Who made me think like that? Who created that standard in the first place? And what the fuck does a minority character have to prove to me or anyone else just to exist in their own story? And if it is inclusion for inclusion's sake, then what is actually wrong with that? Why can't we let characters just be bad? Why can't we just allow writers to try and fail at something? A lot of our characters are based off of other characters. We take inspiration from other stories. We take pieces of other perspectives and craft our own. But if there's a perspective which has been consistently silenced throughout our history, then there's not as much to take inspiration from, is there? Not unless you yourself belong to that underrepresented group. And even then, we will not always know the best way to convey our perspectives through our characters. Perhaps we have something to say or something to prove, but in an effort to do that, we forget what makes a character compelling in the first place. Writers can have a chip on their shoulder. They can also have good intentions when making a character. They can want to be inclusive, and just like any other human being on planet Earth, they can fail at doing that. But to take a writer's failure and apply it to an entire industry, to take a character who was not written as well as they could have been and prop them up as an example of why we should never try that again. That's stupid. The truth is, there are some people like me who wanted to believe my higher standards for minority characters were for the good of those groups. In reality, I allowed my judgment to be clouded by my own internal bias, as well as the arguments of reactionaries who only have an interest in justifying their emotions to a crowd seeking the very same thing. Everybody is looking for a logical, non-racist, non-homophobic argument that they can get away with saying to justify their own discomfort with certain characters being on screen. I'm not here to stand on my soapbox and look down on you or anyone else for having these feelings. And if you think that you don't have them, then good for you. I hope you're right. But if you do have these opinions and you've never allowed yourself to reflect or introspect on those true feelings, then I'm afraid you're always going to be at the mercy of those feelings. The feeling of getting replaced. The feeling of having your favorite hobby stolen from you by outsiders, of getting left behind, seeing other groups getting attention you feel you deserve, constantly, unendingly doom scrolling, wondering if we've lost the culture war. Just stop it, dude. It's not as bad as you think it is, and your world is going to be a lot happier the sooner you learn how to just chill out and not take all of these things so seriously. We tend to review things based on our own internal emotions first before anything else. First impressions are important, and sometimes our discontent with the story can boil down to something as simple and innocuous as the vibes were fucked. That's okay. However, I think it's important to recognize when that's the case. We might set up rules and guidelines for how to create a good story. There may be objective methods of writing something good. We might have standards and expectations for what is good and what is bad storytelling. At the same time, though, I think sometimes we can use those rules as weapons against things which simply are not written for us. Sometimes things do not resonate with us simply because they were not meant to resonate with us. I've seen a lot of people criticizing Attack on Titan's ending, and I think that's a shame. I quite like the ending to Attack on Titan, but I think I understand why it made people upset in the first place. A lot of people don't like to see sad or bittersweet endings. We are all conditioned to expect and appreciate happy endings which go out of their way to save the characters we've come to enjoy, no matter what kind of terrible situation those characters find themselves in. However, I don't think Attack on Titan is a series which has a sad ending. I actually think that Attack on Titan's ending is very contemplative and hopeful. A depiction of life's endless cycles, yes. How our conflict leads to peace and peace leads to conflict. How our individual stories are only one in a series of individual stories throughout time. The world might experience a mass extinction event like the plague, but we humans living our lives are completely incapable of understanding the horror of something like that, simply because we do not live in it. The trauma endured by those who came before us is not trauma we ourselves can always comprehend. Either way, Attack on Titan never tried to appeal to everyone. It simply filled its niche so strongly and so well that it got insanely popular beyond its core niche. I think I like manga and anime more because a lot of those stories are not afraid to be niche. They are not under as much pressure by the marketing department to appeal to every demographic that they can. Mangaka are allowed to try and fail and try again, but that's not really true, is it? No, the reality is that comic books and manga are under the same pressure to succeed with a large audience. We need to look no further than the mountains of dogshit isekai titles which seem to recycle the same few concepts in perpetuity while changing only one thing about those concepts to distinguish themselves. It's not good writing, but it is popular. It's not niche, but it casts a wide enough net that it will garner viewers no matter what, even if those viewers might happen to hate what they're watching. I think a lot of the channels who try to compare manga and comic books and claim that the West has fallen either don't read enough bad manga or are simply discontent with the comic books they grew up with and how those comic books may have changed. I also think there's a demographic of people who are simply bigoted and will have their experiences ruined if anything other than a white man saves the day in the story. The same people who will tell minorities that they don't need a person to look like them for them to like the character, only to throw big hissy fits when the main protagonist does not look like they do. They turn to manga, justifying their internal bigotry by saying they like plenty of non-white characters. Just look how many Japanese people are in this manga. But when it comes to manga and anime, I think it's a lot easier for those types of people to let them in because they are often drawn with a high level of ambiguity. I mean, let's take Zom 100 as an example. Look at the cast of characters. What is actually distinguishing the German girl from the rest of the cast? I mean, yeah, she has blonde hair, blue eyes, and that's about it. When it comes to the other racial features, I mean, all of them could pretty much be white. Right? They could all pass as white people if it's not explicitly stated that they are Japanese. There are plenty of examples of other anime like this, where the only distinguishing feature of a white character and the Japanese character is that one has black hair where the other has blonde hair. But then we go to somebody like All Might from My Hero Academia, who's blonde and very American looking, but completely Japanese. The racial ambiguity carries over to dark-skinned anime characters too. The typical white-haired, dark-skinned design that we always see and yet does not exist in real life. And yes, I know a lot of manga and anime like to give their characters wacky hair colors. However, it seems as if a lot of the dark-skinned characters have white hair for some reason. I mean, it looks good, but that's about it. And if they don't have that, then it could just be a character that's a really tan Japanese girl, or maybe that character actually is intended to be a black person or some mixed race individual. That ambiguity does not confront the reactionary sensibilities just the same, and therefore it gets a pass. And in some cases, these characters can even be used as token examples of why reactionary viewers are not actually racist, because hey guys, I like Bleach and this one dark-skinned character is in it, so there. Anime's not racist, guys. Even though having an example prepared inherently means you're actively trying to find those examples in the first place, let's not forget how Japan tends to treat their gay characters either. It's normally a joke or something hidden deep in the subtext, such as a white lily or something, which is confined to very niche genres like yaoi or yuri. But the literal moment it's featured prominently in the show, or even addressed to any degree beyond whatever floats your boat, we suddenly see anime and manga fans sounding a lot like comic book fans. Weird. Truth is, Japan might still have a lot of systemic issues when it comes to xenophobia and homophobia, but on the whole, they are not as pressed about it as people in America are, for example. They are and will inevitably be making stories like Americans because writing influences writing. These stories that we make are seen by others. They can provide examples of what to do. Even now, we are seeing far more diverse casts of characters in Japanese-made shows. It's not due to some sort of woke agenda, it's due to a cultural shift. It's due to writers influencing other writers with their stories. If there's a cool character you like, then you want to try and recreate that character with your own spin on the idea. It's really that simple. There is no conspiracy when interests align. The fact is, most people don't care one way or the other. They will only ever care about the vibes a story or character gives to them. People will find stories which suit their niche tastes, and when it happens our niche tastes tend to be more foreign than domestic, we retroactively justify those feelings, trying to deconstruct why we no longer enjoy the things we grew up with, or the things which are made in our own country. Manga isn't better than comics. Comics aren't better than manga. You've just got personal tastes and biases which are better served by one or the other. You've got a discontent with how things have changed in your life and in the things that you used to enjoy. The reason for why you no longer enjoy something are your own, but let's stop pretending it has anything to do with a collapse of a society or moral values. Let's just admit that we like what we like because we have personal preferences and beliefs which shape our opinions about anything and everything we consume. Let's just admit to ourselves that sometimes our justifications for disliking something is simply a thin mask we hide behind because we do not wish to confront the possibility that the real reasons we don't like something are petty and bad. Sometimes confronting that possibility can help you enjoy that thing again. So give it a try every once in a while. I promise accepting some of these things will make you a happier person, and it'll definitely make you less of an asshole. If you've made it this far into the video, then thank you so much. I don't always make these topics with politics in mind, but I find when topics are politically charged, they require a political lens. If you want to see something a little bit less political and hear my advice for how to write a good bully character in your story, or why anime don't use their ranking systems very much, then click either of the two videos on screen now. And thank you for watching. I'll see you. And I don't really have an outro. I mean, like I kind of do. Like at the end of a lot of videos, I'll find like a ham-fisted way to be like, you know, such and such, open up a blank document and start writing. But this video wasn't really about writing. It was more about the political stuff. So it would kind of be weird to force that in. And I think I have forced it in sometimes. And yeah, you get the idea. Thanks for watching.